I was raised knowing I was adopted. I was born prematurely, but I didn't find out my survival story until I was 14. The reality is that babies like me survived abortions before Roe versus Wade, and we still have babies who are surviving abortions today. They're saying the word execute is not appropriate, but I think that begs the question, what is the appropriate word that they would use to describe that then? So if this isn't execution, if leaving someone to die who is vulnerable is not infanticide, what is it?
Welcome back to the Bridgehead. Today we're going to be talking to abortion survivor Melissa Ohden, who is a pro-life activist and the author of a powerful memoir titled You Carried Me, A Daughter's Memoir, and the founder of the Abortion Survivors Network. Ohden was expected to be delivered stillborn, but after soaking in a saline solution in the womb for 5 days, she was born alive in 1977, weighing just 2 pounds and 14 ounces. Her grandmother told her 19-year-old mother that the abortion had been successful and urged the medical staff to dispose of the baby girl as quote-unquote medical waste. A nurse heard Melissa cry out weakly and rushed her to a neonatal intensive care unit instead. She was subsequently adopted, and her memoir describes her reestablished relationship with her birth mother and their journey to healing and forgiveness. In a post-Roe world, her story and the stories of those like her are essential. And one of those amplifying their stories has been none other than the GOP presidential candidate, Donald Trump. We invited Melissa on to not only share her stories, but the stories of the many people that she speaks with, and the reality that abortion survivors are an increasing and growing population in not only the United States and Canada, but around the world. Here's our conversation. All right. First off, Melissa, one of the really interesting things about this political cycle has been that abortion is pretty much the nonstop subject of the election from both parties. And I can't recall an election where the subject of abortion survivors has been so prominent. Donald Trump has brought up the fact that babies survive abortion and are left to die, or in his exact phrasing during the presidential debate, are executed many times. And that's been the subject of dozens of fact checks. The Vice President Kamala Harris tried to fact check him in real time, so that never happened. How would you respond to the fact checks at Donald Trump? Is he just sort of hyping up the language for effect, or is what he's describing in the presidential debates and on the campaign trail something that really happens in the United States regularly?
I think he is so brilliant in his choice of words. In reality, right? I think otherwise people would turn a blind eye to this conversation, which, historically they have, except for a select group of us who follow it, acknowledge it, and give space for the voices. So, I met President Trump in the Oval Office in 2019, and even preparing for that, I had friends who had said, we know how you speak about the issue. We know how you understand the issue. Recognize that the language you use and your understanding of it is very different than his. And I think that's an important lens because I am who I am and I do what I do, I wouldn't use the word execute, even though I know that that's what it is, right? I should have been murdered. I should have been left for dead. But those aren't the words that I use, but they are his. And so I think it is a deliberate choice of words. But at the same time, as he then engages people to pay attention, that's when we see them start to go toe to toe with him. And they're saying, well, no, the word execute is not appropriate. But I think that begs the question, what is the appropriate word that they would use to describe that then? I would love to see that as a follow-up. So if this isn't execution, if leaving someone to die who is vulnerable is not execution, is not infanticide, what is it?
It's really interesting because he's been very strong on the issue of late-term abortion, of abortion survivors. In the 2016 debate, I remember watching it live, and when he referred to late-term abortion as ripping the baby out of the womb, Hillary Clinton almost flinched. It was a real moment because even hardcore pro-life Republicans had never previously been willing to use that kind of language. I think they thought it was kind of jarring or vulgar or gauche. But when he did it, he's done a really good job on that particular issue, especially as he backs down from other pro-life views that he held during his first administration. Why did he invite abortion survivors to meet with him at the Oval Office to begin with?
Because he understands the importance of our voices. He understands that we are the intended primary victims of abortion. And, for me, that is one of those things that I will always look back on my life and just be so incredibly grateful to him for. And I know that people have a lot of questions about him and where he stands in his administration. But what I remind people is his back history stands as it is, right? We know the strong stance he has taken. We hear what he is saying right now. And that pales in comparison to the culture of death and what the Democrats are seeking. And I think the Democrats would love nothing more than for us to be focused on what he has or hasn't said, instead of looking at them and saying, no, you guys are the ones that are extreme.
So most people are going to be aware of your story if they've been associated with the pro-life movement. I've been aware of your story for a couple of years. I've interviewed for pieces that I've done on survivors of abortion for various magazines. But for our listeners and our viewers who aren't aware of what your background is, your story as an abortion survivor, maybe tell us that story so they have an idea of where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'm sort of the poster child of a born alive infant. That's a weird thing to have to say in today's world. But, there could be worse things to describe myself. And, the reality is that babies like me survived abortions before Roe versus Wade. Babies like me survived during Roe. And we still have babies who are surviving abortions today. And for me, it is the hardest thing that we live in this culture that gaslights people like me on a regular basis, right? People are sort of left scratching their heads and going, I don't know, am I an abortion survivor? Do I want to be an abortion survivor? I mean, people don't think highly of this experience. It seems to upset people. But I claim it, right? This is who I am. I have no shame anymore about who I am, but it's not always been this way. From a historical standpoint, I am one of those babies who survived not long after Roe versus Wade. And so people could do the math to realize that was back in the 1970s. And, it's sort of interesting because in today's culture, policymakers sort of dismiss my experience, and they tend to do that anytime I testify before Congress or a committee. They'll pass a note and say, saline infusion abortions aren't performed anymore. So the point is what? That you found much more effective ways to make sure that babies like me don't survive abortions? I mean, I feel like that's the implied comment there, but that's not the way they see it, right? They're just like, pass that note. We don't want people to think that this is something that happens anymore. And, my experience is unique in many ways from many survivors, but in the same way, there's lots of similarities. So, I think a similarity is that my birth mother was forced to have that abortion. It was not her choice. Her family forced her to have it. She was 19 years old. The other thing that I have in common with a lot of our population of survivors as well is that the abortionist didn't know how far along she actually was. So my medical records state the abortionist thought she was about 18 to 20 weeks. But when I survived that abortion procedure that poisoned and scalded me for 5 days and then expelled me from the womb, and I was laid aside while arguments were made about whether I would be provided medical care, ultimately rushed off to the NICU. A neonatologist remarked then in my records that he estimated she was probably 31 weeks pregnant with me. And so all this conversation right now of late-term abortion, born alive infants, this doesn't happen. First of all, we know the stats about late-term abortion. And secondly, I want people to realize that women don't often know how far along they really are. And the abortion industry preys upon that. We hear from women routinely who say, you know what, I went in for that abortion, or I took the abortion pills, right? I didn't know how far along I was. And then I found out I was still pregnant. When I had an ultrasound, right, I was weeks or months further along in that pregnancy than what I thought I was.
So we've seen that a few times. There's a couple of cases ongoing in the United Kingdom right now, actually, where women took abortion pills. In one case, after viability, actually. When did you first discover that you had survived an abortion? Because as you've said yourself, and you've written this many times, a lot of kids who have survived an abortion don't know that they survived an abortion. And we even find this working in the pro-life movement with women who are planning to have an abortion and then change their minds. This is not something they want to share with their kids because they're so thrilled that they didn't go through with that. And they don't want to tell their child that they ever were considering making a different decision. So what was it like for you to discover that you had actually survived this procedure?
Yeah, you're so right. It is such a family secret. We actually have found most survivors are raised in their biological family. And so there can be a lot of secrets and or a lot of tension that exists in that family of do I tell, don't I tell, or we're going to tell you, but don't you ever tell anybody else. In my circumstances, I am one of those survivors who is also an adoptee. And so I was raised knowing I was adopted, that I had had a lot of health issues. I was born prematurely, but I didn't find out my survival story until I was 14. And really by accident. I have an older sister who faced an unplanned pregnancy. And when her parents found out that she was unsure about what she was going to do with that pregnancy, they told her my story. And so cue all the drama of being the age of 14 and in an argument, having my sister let it slip that she felt more wanted by her birth parents than I was by mine. We were both adoptees. And, there is no way that I can tell you what that night was like in my life except complete and utter devastation. But I love that in the grand scheme of things, I now get to look back on that moment and we use it for such good at the Abortion Survivors Network, coming alongside families with young survivors to say, listen, we don't have to keep this on a shelf. We don't need to keep it a secret. We can find age-appropriate ways to talk about abortion, then let them know that babies survive abortions. And then over time, we let that child know that they're a survivor. So, just recently, I got a birthday gift from a little girl who is now 11 or 12, who survived a late-term abortion in Serbia and is an adoptee. I mean, those moments, how could I not be who I am? Because that is the best stuff in the world.
Did you have any views on abortion before you found out about your own origin story at all?
Yeah, I did. I think obviously that moment solidified a lot of things for me, right? Any of that sort of gray area I had, because I think, at the age of 14, if you would have had to ask me, I would have said, yeah, I'm pro-life, but I think there should be exceptions to that. The typical ones that we still hear people say. And in that moment of time, I can still feel what happened inside of me. It was like this thunderbolt where I went, oh my gosh, if I think that's okay for anybody, then I would have to say that that's okay for me. And I think, again, that's such a missing piece for a lot of people, right? It's easy for people to say, well, who am I to say? Well, why would you think that this isn't something that could have happened to you? Because that's a game changer when you realize that if you're going to paint with that broad brushstroke, then everyone had like a 50-50 shot of not being aborted.
No, it's interesting because I've always thought people like yourself and the other abortion survivors who have actually gone public and spoken up about their stories are kind of like the living evidence that abortion isn't about a what, as abortion activists would claim, but it really is about a who. And you are the ones that shouldn't have made it, but did, and are kind of almost reporting from this different dimension. These are the people that you were trying to get rid of. We are the ones that weren't supposed to exist, but did. Do you ever feel that way?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think it is a very surreal thing. And it's sort of like the world is having a conversation about us without engaging us in that conversation, right? It's sort of like you're sitting in the room and everybody's talking about you, but you're like, hey, I'm here. So for us, that's been a good thing. I say good thing. It's also a hard thing when we have something like the debate happen and it has this huge backlash. We can use that all for good. And it's been really amazing for me to see people who I otherwise wouldn't have seen, I think, engage in some of these conversations, really driving people to our organization to say, man, not only does this happen, but there's an organization that supports the people and they're ran by somebody who this happened to. So I feel like this is sort of a great opportunity in our culture, right? This is a long game. I know that we have a lot of ground to cover when it comes to changing hearts and minds, but there is something really amazing happening right now.
This is something that I'd wanted to ask you because I frequently think of yourself and others who have been so personally impacted by abortion when I'm thinking about the fact that this is the first real abortion election where the entire debate is essentially on abortion, where Vice President Kamala Harris is doing like a 52-stop reproductive rights tour. And unlike previous Democratic candidates, she doesn't even pretend to feel any ambiguity about abortion at all. She is unwilling to say it should be safe, legal, and rare, like Clinton deceitfully did. She doesn't nod towards the fact that late-term abortions happen and pull back from that. She just insists that, late-term abortions don't happen at all. And if they do, they're good. What is it like for yourself and other abortion survivors to hear this enormous debate going on around you when it's both something that you have political and moral convictions about, but which is also so personal for you?
Yeah, it's hard not to take it personally. People say that sometimes, well, you can't take it personally. Well, it's really hard not to when people are flat out lying and fighting for that very thing that should have taken your life and has caused immense suffering, not only in your own life, but in other people. So it is a bit, it's unnerving. I know for a lot of survivors, we see a lot of folks. I mean, I know the word triggered is overused these days, but I can tell you that for survivors, they are very much triggered by that. Our social workers on our team go into crisis mode, working with survivors the minute something like that happens, because it brings up everything that we've already experienced, which is, we're unwanted, we're unloved, we're unworthy. Nobody wants to see you. Nobody wants to hear you. Nobody's going to believe you. And it really does, if you keep hearing it, if you keep seeing it on social media, it really does cause you sometimes to question yourself. For those survivors who don't have medical records, they do sort of have this crisis where they're like, I don't know, maybe what my family told me wasn't real. Maybe I don't want it to be real. And that's the part that I get pretty righteously indignant about, which is instead of fighting against us and causing more shame and suffering, just admit it. You're admitting everything else. So what's the big deal? Why can't you admit that we are a thing? We are people. This is a situation. Do my population a favor and stop hurting us, because that's exactly what they're doing. And really, Jonathon, they're not just hurting survivors. They're hurting the women who went through this, right? Behind every survivor, there's a mom who experienced this. And their extended family members. There's abortionists and clinic workers. Man, do us a favor and allow us some space to heal and have a voice.
When you refer to your population, this was something I realized I'd never asked you before. How old were you when you realized that your story wasn't a crazy one-off that had just happened to you, but that there were other people like you out there who'd had the same experience and gone through the same emotions and had a lot of the same struggles about this?
Yeah, most survivors think they are a one-off, right? Most survivors will say, I thought I was the only one. I felt like such a freak. And again, I think the abortion industry loves that, of let them feel alone, let them be silenced. We don't want them to know, because what would happen if they knew they weren't alone? What would happen if they found their voice and they raised them together, right? That's what changes the world. And that's why we do what we do. But it took me about 5 years after I found out my story initially. I'll age myself. That's when we got the internet. The good old days, as I tell my kids. But, that was a game changer for me, because when I Googled, are there other abortion survivors, I came across Gianna Justin's story. And it doesn't matter how many times I tell that story, I can tell you where I was sitting. And to see her face and know that I wasn't the only one, that was such a relief to me. And that was my first kind of step into the light, to go, okay, if there's another person like me, then I don't need to feel quite so ashamed about this. And I would say, if I look through our files, yesterday, I know my social workers were in contact with 17 different people. Now, granted, not all of those are abortion survivors, but I know that probably about a third of them probably are. And so we see that anytime there is a significant conversation about abortion and we have the opportunity to be in the media and speak truth, we see this huge outgrowth of survivors who find out they're not alone.
So when I first heard your story, I heard Gianna Jessen's story first, just like you did. I think she was one of the few survivors who went public, and she gave this beautiful speech that went viral several times, I believe, where she kind of talks about her story and how she's grappled with being a survivor, because the reality is that abortion survivors are actually evidence of the abortion industry having failed. And
Yep.
that's, of course, what they hate the most, is because when you actually meet somebody who's an abortion survivor, it's like, well, what a beautiful failure. And so those contrasts, I think, are incredibly damning for an organization like Planned Parenthood. But when I look what's just happened over the last couple of years, so one, Donald Trump has really made the existence of abortion survivors, born alive abortions, the killing of children after birth, a centerpiece of both his 2016 campaign and is doing so again now. But you've also been doing an enormous amount of work drawing attention to this as well. So you have the Abortion Survivors Network. You first had your own memoir, then you published a second book, which I highly recommend to everybody, sharing many stories of different abortion survivors. And so what was this transition like from you being a person with a really intense, really powerful, and really unique personal story to somebody who has not only become part of a movement, but I would argue that your work has been creating that movement, bringing people together, merging these disparate voices into one voice. That voice is being heard not only in Congress, but again, you were invited to the Oval Office. What has it been like to go on this journey of putting together this movement and hearing all of these stories, which must be in some ways both amazing, but it also must be almost re-traumatizing to hear the story repeated to you over and over and over again?
Yeah, for me, it is sort of this exercise in knowing my boundaries, right? What my bandwidth is. And I have high bandwidth. If you survive an abortion, most of us have pretty high bandwidth. So I've learned to run with it. That's a lesson to take away from that. But, for me, it really has been just an honor for people to share their stories, right? I started to hear people's stories like 17 years ago, and I would do everything I could to help them, and got to the point where there was so much that needed to be done that I had to build an organization, build a team who could serve day in and day out. And so, it really is part of my transformation. And I can tell you it has made me stronger than ever, because I'm not just fighting for women like my birth mother and for babies who are going to lose their lives to abortion that I want to work to save, but I am, I'm fighting for my population of survivors. And it has brought this fire to me that I guess has always been here. People always say, right, we always knew you were fiery. But if you've noticed me getting a little more fiery, it's because I just become more passionate. The more stories you hear, the more injustice you see, the more that fire grows inside of you. And, people are going to see us sharing more and more stories. We've shifted mission a couple times after Roe was overturned, because we started to see different needs coming about. We heard from a lot of women initially after Dobbs who said, I've taken abortion pills and I think I'm still pregnant, or I am still pregnant. I'm going to have another abortion. So we've learned a lot through women's voices. And again, I'm incredibly honored that women trust us with their stories. The culture out there, the Democrats would say, women who have had abortions and the babies who survive them, they must be in conflict. No, we're actually not. We're not. We're more alike than we are different. We need healing. And families are forever impacted, even by abortions that don't go as planned. And so it has been such an incredible thing for me to see that when we serve survivors and heal them and empower them to find their voice, and they start to use it no matter how and where, ultimately it's bringing families along that journey. Families who otherwise didn't want to talk about this, or, were loosely supportive of one another, now are healing. And for me, that's it doesn't get any better than that for me.
So if people have heard stories of abortion survivors, they've likely heard the story of yourself and Gianna Jessen, who were both targeted with a saline abortion. And then maybe the story of Claire Colwell, whose twin was successfully aborted, but she survived the abortion that killed her twin. Most people haven't heard many other stories, but you hear these stories every day. Which stories would you be willing to share with our listeners and viewers?
I think one that I would encourage your viewers to check out was in the Washington Post back in the spring of 2024. And I used it to testify before a Democrat-led committee earlier this year where they were talking about the nightmare of abortion bans. In this Washington Post story this spring, they were attempting to take Texas state laws and really say what a terrible thing they were. And actually what they did, Jonathan, was tell the story of a woman named Evelyn who experienced 2 rounds of abortion drugs failing months apart. So in this Washington Post article, they actually talked about how she fell unconscious for a period of time when she saw a heartbeat on an ultrasound, because women aren't told this, right? Women aren't told, hey, by the way, that's a separate living human being that you are attempting to end the life of. And P.S., a complication of abortion is that sometimes they don't work. And so that's still a living human being that you're carrying. And so that you're going to have another procedure to end their life, right? Women aren't told these things. And so in this Washington Post article, they tell that story. And they go on to say, not only did she experience 2 rounds of abortion drugs failing, but then she was given $12,000 by part of the abortion lobby to go to New Mexico and have a late-term abortion. But when she had an ultrasound there, she was scanned at 28 weeks, and the abortionist was only trained to conduct abortions up until 24. Ultimately, she then carried the baby to term and placed kiddo for adoption. This survivor, who may never know that they're a survivor, if they Google their name, they're going to find out, is now over a year old. And how different that story could have been. How much trauma for that survivor, how much trauma for Evelyn. And the Democrats, when I asked them very pointedly, right, this was your solution? This is the answer to a woman's problems, is everything that Evelyn experienced. Can't we all agree that she deserves better?
And what did they respond when you asked them that?
The only response that day was the note that said, Saline, abortions aren't performed routinely anymore.
So even if they're not performed routinely, so have you ever gotten any coherent answer from a Democrat about abortion survivors at all? Because all of the recent survivors and many of the stories that you include in your book have nothing to do with saline abortion.
Right. No, there is no response. I think the only thing I've ever heard was, hey, I wanted to let you know that I heard you. Thanks.
Okay. Right. Well, yeah, that's very, very interesting. Kind of like the whole I see you while trying very hard not to at the same time.
Right. And again, I think this is where it's been such a powerful part of my kind of evolution as a leader. My background is in therapy, but also in various areas of social justice. And so now this has been sort of my great opportunity to bring in other voices, because it's one thing to see or hear a few of us, right, and sort of pat us on the head and go, yeah, there's just like a couple of them, aren't they cute? Well, it's a whole other thing to talk about a whole population of people who are being marginalized and silenced. And I can't think of any other population in our culture that the Democrats would be okay with being silenced and marginalized. Because it involves the word abortion, they're like, oh, cool, keep them quiet.
So what's your plan for the Abortion Survivors Network? Because you mentioned a few minutes ago that the mission has changed somewhat. It was first sort of a gathering place for people to be able to tell their stories, be heard, get assistance if they need to, find ways of coping with the story and coping within their families. But you've also testified before Congress. You've told your story many places, and you've activated a lot of people by your story, by essentially lending your face to the legions of children who did not survive. And so what would you say the mission and mandate of the network is right now?
Right. So historically, we were doing a lot behind the scenes. People would still see us out in the public eye, mostly me. And then we went through this transition of, activating a lot of people. And what we have tried to find the balance of is offering resources and empowering folks to find and use their voice. And so we feel like we found this kind of scalable middle where we need to be right now. And so our newly designed website will launch sort of mid-October, and y'all are going to love it. It is phenomenal, story-based, right? That's what we want. We want people, whether they're a survivor, a mother who has walked through this or is right now, or maybe a policymaker, somebody off the street, we want people to enter into our stories and be willing to listen, right? There's so much that people can relate to if they would allow themselves the opportunity to listen. And so it's going to be story driven and allow people the opportunity to record their stories or type it up right there on our website. Nobody in the pro-life movement that I'm aware of has ever had a tool like that on their website. And so we want to reduce the obstacles that people encounter in sharing their story. Now, granted, we still have a lot of back end work to keep people safe and vet stories and things like that. But what we have found with survivors and moms, even, is more than anything, they want to be heard and they want to share their story some way, somehow. And so we're going to give them that opportunity. And, it's really our hope that that plus breaking down data and analyzing it is going to allow us to even equip medical professionals, adoption professionals, pregnancy center staff. So taking those key pieces and really amplifying it while we still are supporting survivors and moms by offering them community and a lot of self-guided things that they can run with. So we're reaching that, I think, fine balance between the public stuff and the private stuff that we do.
So I wanted to get into the data, but first, you touched on something that has been bothering me for quite a while, because we've seen the tactics of sort of the elite storytellers of our culture shift post Dobbs. Because prior to Dobbs, abortion actually rarely came up in Hollywood. Hollywood worked to mainstream the sexual revolution in almost every way, but abortion was only a tragedy that happened here and there. And it showed up in a few sitcoms and stuff like that. But there was one study done on it, actually, and it indicated that almost every time a crisis pregnancy surfaced, that pregnancy would end up with a baby that was welcomed by everybody, because people didn't want, feticide. They wanted a happy ending. And even pro-choice people knew that abortion wasn't a happy ending. We're seeing a distinct shift in tactics where now Hollywood's really ramping up the propaganda machine, because they recognize that, as you said, stories are really, really powerful. Stories slip under people's defenses. They force people to look at something in a new way. They force people to step into somebody else's shoes, which grants them an empathy that might be inaccessible through just data or argument or philosophy. And so now you're seeing, that movies like, Call Jane, which was about, lionizing the illegal abortionists in Chicago. You had Unpregnant, the HBO abortion road trip comedy where an abortion was the happy ending. A grittier road trip film the same year on another road trip where a girl with her friend is going to find somewhere to get an abortion out of state because parental permission is needed at home. And the Center for Reproductive Rights has a creative council led by Elizabeth Banks, and they've said, we're going to really lean into abortion storytelling. One of our key focuses is how to get abortion storytelling into all of these different movies and TV shows. And a recent study came out indicating that this is successful, that they actually do change people's minds about abortion. And we are not very good at telling stories about abortion. There have been a couple of different pro-life films, some of them pretty good, some of them horrible and utterly unrealistic and totally disconnected from the human experience as people actually live it. I won't name which ones are which, but I'm sure everybody knows which ones we're talking about. How can you take the stories that you're accruing, the story you told in your memoir, the stories you're hearing every day, the stories you're going to be accumulating on this website, and use those stories to compete with what the abortion industry is so cleverly doing?
Yeah, you've caught our vision, right? That this is, as we empower survivors and those impacted by unsuccessful abortions to find and use their voice. Really, that is what we want, is to take the lead in pro-life storytelling. There are various people who have done a good job, but we haven't done it consistently. And we haven't competed with the abortion industry. They outstory us every single day, right? You don't have to look far at headlines to go, holy smokes. Yep. Now, granted, yes, they will always outspend us. They have the media in their back pocket. But as I've trained other leaders in the movement, I have said, we can't use that as an excuse. And I refuse to. I will not use them and their skill set to make an excuse for why we won't do it. And so that's exactly where we're heading, is really starting up a whole storytelling initiative within the pro-life movement. Folks will see us here yet this fall launching some pro-life training with other organizations. I'm not afraid to name a couple of them right now, Secular Pro-Life and the Leadership Institute, because we all have this vision of equipping those with stories to stay well and share their stories and give them opportunities. So many people will say, right, I've got this great pro-life story, but nobody listens or there isn't a place for it. Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem. And so we're going to be doing some things about that, but we're going to train kind of 3 different groups: those with a story, those organizations who can use stories in a more consistent way, because a one-off is getting us nowhere, right? I appreciate campaigns that we do. They make a great impact. But one campaign not proliferating our country or the world, we can't just be patting ourselves on the back and going, hey, good job. No, this is a day in and day out. We have to have a campaign. Folks need to know that the stories are there and be able to amplify it. And it needs to be something that we can keep coming back to rely on, instead of right when an amendment kicks up and folks need to create an ad or tell a story and raise $1 million or more for that ad. This is how we lose. So we'll be training. There will be sets of training starting in November. We'll be doing them online sort of November, December, and into January. We'll be doing some in-person things at the March for Life. So those with a story, organizations who need to tell more stories, and the everyday folks who need to know how to include stories in their messaging, right? Again, that's what the abortion lobby is so great at. They can tell a story and we don't even know if it's true, right? Kamala in the debate, I don't know if you were doing the same thing I was, but I was listening to her going, who is she even talking about? But people believe it.
And we know it's not true. And we know, we know that the whole story about Savita Halappanavar in Ireland was untrue. The story that they tried to use to legalize abortion in Malta wasn't true. The story that they used in Argentina wasn't true. They troll hospital for stories that they can use to say, look, abortion kills women, regardless of whether or not that's the case. But they'll make them up if they have to.
Yeah. And all the while, those with the stories that are accurate and inconvenient are pushed to the sidelines. And so, we're in this brave new world where we're all in to lead the initiative, because we know the importance of these stories, and not only to change our culture, but to simply even reach those who believe that they're alone, including the women going through this right now. I mean, that's the stuff that also really does make me indignant, is that no woman should have to feel like they're the only woman that this has ever happened to.
That's so interesting, because one of the ways that people want to hide experiences like those that you and other survivors have endured, and to just obscure this whole part of the debate, is the fact that abortion really is a subject that touches on all of the subjects that literary figures and filmmakers usually love to talk with, right? Most of these are, you've got, it's sex, death, killing, murder, family, internecine, drama within relationships. It's all there. And yet you'll look for a very long time before you find any work of literature or movie that grapples with that subject on its own terms as a morally complex issue. I think one of the only great writers I can think of who did it, besides Ernest Hemingway, would probably be Philip K. Dick, who actually wrote a story about abortion just after Roe, in response to Roe, which now, when they publish all of his books, they leave that story out. I had to buy an old copy of a science fiction magazine to find that story and read it. And so I'm really glad that you're planning to work and get these stories out there. Monica Snyder of Secular Pro-Life is just a wonderful person. She's a real visionary, and I appreciate so much what she does. How are you going to work to get these stories off the internet and into everybody's hands? Because it's a Herculean task. But when we say we want to tell stories about abortion, the stories, I've read your story and I've heard it from you directly. I've read the stories of other survivors. All of the ingredients are there to capture people's imaginations and to change the way that they think about the issue, or at least to nuance how they think, to change aspects of their worldview. How can we get stories like this to everybody on the same mass scale that the abortion industry does it?
Well, and that's what we are in the beginnings of. It really does take, first of all, those in leadership in the pro-life movement and the conservative movement to understand it. Right? I mean, I know I don't mean for this to sound negative, but in reality, a lot of leaders, even in the movement, don't understand how often it happens and what the dynamics are like. And so I have found that as a leader that I can't just believe that everyone knows it. And so I sort of had to go out of my way to plant those seeds with folks to say, you know what, thank you for all you've done over the last 50 years, but can I help you understand the reality of this right now? So that's been sort of step one. And I can tell you that leaders have caught the vision and they're excited about it. And so I think a lot of it is just what we've dealt with post Dobbs, which is we are all on fire, right? Everything is coming so quickly that as leaders, there's so much we want to do, but then so much that is coming at us. So it's been sort of this like deliberate trying to find time to slow down and squeeze things in. And so you will see more of those trainings. You are going to see more kind of cross collaborative meetings and trainings and even campaigns like we did with Almost Aborted when Students for Life put that in Times Square. I think we had 6, 7, including me, survivors and a mom included in that. That's pretty epic. And so you're going to see more of that, right? So it's sort of like doing one thing at a time and then increasing the frequency of it. And part of what we're doing is working with a great marketing team, and you will see us create a story bank. And then over time, increase the kind of writing that will help people take that and utilize it. Again, that's what the other side does so well, right? They're all repeating the same stories. They all are using the same language. Good news, we can do that too. And we can be kind to the people with the stories. We can care about them. And that's what sets us apart.
So I guess I wanted to kind of close the conversation by digging into some of the data, because we started the conversation by talking about the fact checks of Donald Trump, and you kind of explained that he has his own way of delivering this message. It's primed for effect. He uses the word execute, and he often refers to Governor Ralph Northam's horrible statements about, the baby's born, we set it aside, we decide whether or not that baby is going to be cared for or not. Is surviving an abortion frequent? I know that in Canada, Stats Canada indicates this, and I know that our leaders here in Canada actually just essentially treat the issue as if it's part of abortion. And in fact, when we found out that 492 babies had been born alive and left to die back in 2013, this was already, and several members of Parliament requested an RCMP investigation into this. Stephen Harper, who was the Prime Minister at the time, the Conservative Prime Minister, his only response was abortion is legal in Canada, and everybody knows that, as if these victims kind of got shoved under the umbrella of legally protected feticide. But is this something that happens once in a while? Is there just a handful of you, or do we have real data that indicates that there are thousands, if not more, people who have survived abortions, that this is something that happens regularly?
Right. And the data is very limited. And really, that's just simply because they don't want to know. Yeah. There is no standardized reporting in the United States. We don't even have all states in the United States that report out the number of abortions being performed. The best data that we get at is from Canada. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this study yet, but ACOG published this second trimester study. And it was a sample of almost 14,000 second trimester abortions. And, in this study, they were actually looking at, how do you prevent a live birth, right? This is me just sort of ad-libbing, but that's essentially what it was, right? Like the risk of live birth without feticide. Hi, fact checkers, you might want to start there, first of all. And in this study, so this was a Quebec study, Quebec alone. And in this study, there was an 11.2% failure rate of those second trimester abortions. For those induction of labor, which again, this is where people start to get uncomfortable and they're like, what? No, this isn't a thing. Listen, we need to talk about induction of labor as a means of abortion. This is a situation. This is what is leading to born alive infants and questions about what happens to them. But when it came to that particular type of abortion, they had over a 15% failure rate of induction of labor. And even for a D&E abortion, it was running a 0.2% failure rate, which correlates with other numbers that my research team has looked at out of Canada when we've looked through the archives, including the Johnson archives there in Canada. we found regularly that the surgical abortion failure rate is about 0.21% routinely. Now, interestingly enough, when we looked at Australia, which Australia also has some of the best statistics, they run the same failure rate of surgical abortions, right about 0.21%. So when you correlate that to the United States in particular, that looked like 1,734 abortion survivors of surgical abortions alone in the last reporting period. That's just 1 year. That's not chemical abortions that are failing, right? And multiple attempts to abort that baby who has survived. That's not including at-home attempts to abort, which we know they love to market, right? Do it at home. Nobody's going to know. The number, Jonathan, if we realized it, it's absolutely staggering.
I realized how staggering it was just because, so I'm on the road a lot doing pro-life presentations, and I'd have people come up to me, in one small town in British Columbia. I had a lady come up to me. She was in her 60s. She's like, I was a nurse. I remember the baby being born alive and the doctor panicking and picking the baby up and throwing it into the garbage can. And she said he wouldn't let me go near the garbage can, but I could hear rustling amongst the papers for the next minutes. I've heard multiple stories like that from people who have never talked about it publicly, but just felt they had to share that story with somebody. And, somebody who just gave a presentation on why abortion is bad seems like a pretty safe person to have that conversation with. I want to emphasize for people, and I wanted to ask you about this. When you say the failure of surgical abortion, we are talking about kids being born without limbs or with scarred heads, right? People who bear the wounds of abortion for the rest of their life. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, not everybody bears the external wounds, right? For me, surviving a saline abortion, right, an installation procedure, I was poisoned and scalded, but I don't have what people would see on the outside, any lasting scars from that. We have survivors, yes, who have cerebral palsy because of lack of oxygen. That's part of what Gianna went through. We have some survivors who have a lot of facial disfigurement, or, their hearing is impaired. We have survivors who, yes, do have some like slash marks all over their torso because of a DNC. So it does look different from person to person. But again, this is not okay for the abortion industry and lobby and policymakers to try to use that against us. It's like, would they listen to me more if I was disfigured? Would they listen to me if I was missing a limb? I don't think so. That's disingenuous. They aren't listening to any of our survivors any more so who have those physical scars. Don't use it against me that I don't have the physical scars. Trust me, my internal ones are more than enough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you, if you can encapsulate this, when you get a chance to speak to somebody for just a few minutes, say a pro-choice politician, what is the message that you're trying to bring them on behalf of yourself and the survivors that you speak to?
This is a real situation, right? Babies survive abortions. We have for a long time. And the moms who are going through this need support, right? They need medical assistance during a pregnancy. Those babies who survived abortions need quality medical care. This should be documented in their medical records, right? This isn't something that should be pushed under the rug. We need to know that it has happened, care for that woman going through it and the baby, and then provide a plan, right? This should not be us funding the abortion industry time and time again. How about we start talking about this and do something to support the women going through it and the survivors, and then improve their outcomes, right? I mean, no, I don't want this to be a situation at all, right? With abortion at all. But if this is happening, could we do something to break this pattern that has existed for decades, right? Let's document it, let's serve people well, and let's improve outcomes in families so mom can bond with baby if she's raising them after the abortion failed. There can be bonding and attachment, not unhealthy stuff, not neglect, not abuse, right? Trust me, the stories that I know about what happens when we don't talk about this and don't treat it, it is terrible. And so this is an injustice, not only that it's occurring, but then we're continuing the pattern. And so that's what I ask people who are supporting this process to say is, can you at least acknowledge that we need to do better?
Melissa, where can people find Where can they find your contact information, your website, your memoir? Where can they get all the things?
Abortionsurvivors.org is our website. Again, it's going to be amazing here in just a few short weeks. We are on X at the ASN Official. We are on Instagram and Facebook at the Abortion Survivors Network. My personal website is melissaohden.com, and you can find my handles at Melissa Ohden on every social media as well.
Thank you so much for taking so much time to talk to us.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Bridgehead Interviews. If you'd like to download this podcast, you can try out Apple Podcasts. You can get us from Spotify. You can get us pretty much wherever you download your podcast content. If you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, please do so. Also, like the video and write a comment if you'd like us to beat the algorithm. Thank you so much.